Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. I want to talk about the letter that James wrote, because I think James is really the first letter that was written in the New Testament. And I say that for a couple reasons. First of all, James was written to a Jewish audience. There's just no doubt about it. When you read James's letter, there's 5 chapters, but there's so much Jewish language. For instance, he writes it in verse 1 to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad. That's very, very Jewish language from the Old Testament. Also, he calls their assembly in chapter 2, the word he actually uses for assembly in verse 2, for if a man comes into your assembly, is the word for synagogue in the Greek, which is also, again, a very Jewish kind of assembly. Also, he just makes so many allusions to the Old Testament scriptures. He quotes Old Testament scriptures. He talks about Abraham. He talks about Job. He talks about Elijah. He addresses a lot of Jewish issues, like the fact that some Jews had the concept that rich people, if you were rich, it just meant that you were blessed by God. If you were poor, you must have been cursed. And so it created an attitude of favoritism among them. And James has to write about that in chapter 2. And it's also Jewish in that it uses a Jewish style of literature based on the Old Testament wisdom literature. In fact, James kind of reads in some ways like the book of Proverbs does in the Old Testament, where there's not really necessarily a logical flow to the letter, but it's a bunch of different chunks and paragraphs about differing topics, and the topics jump around, and there's not really much of a flow to it. He'll talk about wisdom for 1 second, and then the next second he'll be talking about what faith is about and how it's about action. He'll be talking about riches, and then he'll jump back to wisdom again, and then he'll jump back to riches, and then faith, and then controlling your tongue, and all these very practical admonitions. James is a very, very practical book for everyday Christian living, and it's heavily Jewish in nature. Now, the reason that helps me think that that's one of the first books written is because there is no mention of the classic theological issue in the New Testament, and that is the Jew and Gentile issue. And that's why I think that James was written even before the gospel spread to Gentiles, meaning before Acts chapter 10, or at least right around that time when the gospel maybe had spread to Cornelius in Acts 10, but wasn't really fully widespread enough for the Jews to really have this incredible tension between themselves and the Gentiles, and can Gentiles really be saved without becoming Jewish? That is an issue that has to be addressed in so many other letters, and James doesn't mention a thing about it. And another thing is, James talks about trials a lot. He talks a lot about suffering and temptation and enduring and trusting in God. In fact, that's how he starts his letter in verse 2. Consider it all joy, brethren, when you encounter various trials. Okay, that's what makes me place this letter early on in Acts, because he addresses this letter to Jews, the 12 tribes who have been dispersed abroad. Well, notice Acts chapter 8, because we talked about this a long time ago, but notice Acts 8, when at this point the church was only Jewish. It was in the city of Jerusalem, and Saul comes along and he starts persecuting the church, so that it says in verse 4, those who had been scattered went about preaching the word. So here are these Jewish Christians who are persecuted, and they go out and scatter to different areas teaching the gospel. We get a little more insight into that in Acts chapter 11 and verse 19. Acts 11:19, so then those who were scattered because of the persecution that occurred in connection with Stephen, they made their way to Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except to Jews alone. So my argument is that sometime in this period between Acts 8, when the Jews were scattered, and Acts 11, when the Jews here are still scattered, but then they're going to start turning toward the Gentiles, that's when James wrote this letter. I believe James was James, the brother of the Lord, and he probably wrote them this letter from Jerusalem. And think about it. They scattered, but the apostles stayed in Jerusalem, and the prophets stayed in Jerusalem. And so it only makes sense that it was either James, the brother of the Lord, or James the Apostle, who wrote that letter to them, because here are a bunch of scattered Christians. They're new Christians. They don't fully understand how to live as Christians, and so this letter is written to them to teach them practically how to live the Christian life. And it just makes so much sense why James writes what he writes, considering the suffering they've been through, considering this new teaching about salvation by faith and not by keeping the works of the law. They need to understand the nature of faith, considering their presuppositions from the Old Testament. That's why James was written. I sure hope that's clear and helpful, and Lord willing, I'll see you next time.